to part 2 of our episode on Marmaduke Carter. Last time we talked about his early life, what it was like to grow up in the late 19th, early 20th century as a Black Lutheran within the context now of a German immigrant synod. Today we'll look at how he continued his ministry and how he formed and presented his unique confessional Lutheran identity to a broader audience. A lot of the stuff we talk about just with any immigrant group coming to America, identity is big, and now it's a lot of different worlds colliding here in Christianity in general, in America in general, and just talking about race in general, and then even the Lutheran identity. It's all, how do we mesh this together and figure it out? And I think we see that play out and what you had discussed in his published works. So maybe just taking an overview first, what stands out from Carter's published works? What did he write? What did he publish? And what's remarkable about them?
He wrote and did a number of presentations, but unfortunately, the only things we have are two of his written works. One of them was a book called Lutheran Customs, a popular presentation of the habits of Lutherans. And so this is a book that he wrote based on a series of lectures for his own congregation that describes why Lutherans do what they do. So it was going through different things like worship practices and baptisms and Lord's Supper and why they name babies the way they do, and all sorts of different things from the theological to just the practical. And he says, why are we different? Why is the culture of our church different from the other churches around us? So the other work that survived is a title called Why Negro Lutherans Should Joyfully Participate in the Centennial Celebration of the Saxon Immigration, which he presented to the 5th General Conference of Negro Mission Workers that took place so I can't analyze them, but this one was popular enough at the conference that they voted to publish it in full in their minutes, which is pretty great for me. And so this was for a meeting of the Negro workers that would get together every 2 years. It was started as almost as a protest group, because the Black church workers didn't have any official voting authority in the synodical conference. And so they would get together and pass resolutions that would advise the people who were in charge, hoping to change their minds about some things. And this was one of the presentations that took place at these, and fortunately they printed it.
So I have some follow-up questions on this second work here. How did he describe kind of we'll use the term a Black Lutheran perspective, and filter it through like a biblical context? Like he's describing his faith through the Bible, but he's also bringing in some other things too.
Yeah, so the book the presentation is really interesting. It's done in a setting when the celebration of the Saxon immigration is coming up. And so, that's the CFW Walther and the Missouri and all of that stuff. And so it's in this context that he's saying, what do we have to do with this celebration? All those white people are celebrating this thing. We're not Saxons. Why do we care? And so he says, well, maybe we should care. Maybe we can participate in this, even though we're not Saxons. And so what he does is he divides his paper into two sections. First, there's a section about justification, where he just explains the doctrine of justification. And then, second, there's a section where he talks about how that doctrine of justification came to America through the Saxons. In the first section, he's really clever about how he uses sources. He states a thesis and then proves it based on starting with the Bible, then with the Confessions, then with German theologians, then with German American theologians like Pieper and Walther. And so he builds this trail from the Bible to Luther to Germany to America, and then would have been to Black Lutherans who heard from these Saxon immigrants. And so it's an ideological trail through history that would have led up to the doctrine of justification that they had heard. And then in the second section, he takes this doctrine and says how it was lost in the Middle Ages. Martin Luther rediscovered it, and then it traveled through the Lutheran Church until the Saxon immigrants left Germany to come to Missouri to preserve their religious doctrine. And so he basically says that they didn't come to America for economic gain or for anything like that. They came because they wanted to keep this doctrine of justification pure. And then it's from there, starting in 1877, that the Saxons and others, that's how he puts it, the Saxons and those other Lutherans got together and brought the gospel of justification to the Black, now Lutherans of the South. And he shows how that celebration of the Saxon immigration actually is a celebration of the coming of the gospel to America and to the Black Lutherans in the South. And he writes some things that are very striking that I can only quote because you have to hear it in his voice. So early on in the paper, he writes this: "We of the Negro Mission of the Lutheran Church and members of the same time of the Negro race rejoice in Luther's work because we are Lutherans. That means we also know that we have been reconciled to God and that the forgiveness of sins was granted to us. We rejoice that God saw to it that the central doctrine of Scripture was restored and uncovered. Otherwise, we would never heard of it. We, as Negro Lutherans, rejoice that the knowledge of justification has been set forth in the gospel, and although lost to the world for centuries, it has, in the last centuries, been found again and published abroad. We rejoice that the Saxons 100 years ago dedicated their coming here to the publication of that truth. We rejoice that their coming means that we have heard it. Therefore, we may also joyfully participate in the next year's centennial celebration because 60 years ago, he moved the children of those Saxons to begin teaching us the glories of the doctrine of justification by grace through faith." Later on, he writes, "Economic conditions and economic aspirations brought nearly all others who came here, that is, to America. These Germans came here that they might have and hold the spiritual treasures which God had given their forefathers 300 years before. In their day, correct doctrine had practically left Germany. Should they remain there, they would be in danger of losing their appreciation for pure doctrine. And finally, men brought us here for gain and for such a degree of oppression as would foster and promote that gain. But as was the case with Joseph, God meant it unto good for us. He lifted us from the homeland, that his grace and mercy might stretch across the sea to bless us in this new land. God resolved that our coming here would result in being contacted by divine grace." With that, we should let that sink in. He says, God used slavery to make us Lutherans, and we should celebrate that. That actually wasn't an uncommon sentiment in the literature of the day. Rosa Young also writes that at least once in her autobiography, and it's also in several two of the books that were published during that time that were the early histories of this movement. And so it was really a common theme to say, yes, slavery was awful, but it meant that we could be Lutherans. Wow. I actually have a really hard time processing slavery as that. It is really hard for me to be able to put myself in a mindset where I could say, like, oh yeah, God used slavery for good to bring us the Lutheran doctrine of salvation, and so we should celebrate it. I can't even think about it. I'm struggling for words, but I guess he didn't.
Yeah, that phrase from Joseph to his brothers, was, "You intended enslaving me for evil, but God intended it for good." And it's just the human evil is something that's doesn't limit God and his good intentions, and he can overpower that. Yeah, that's a statement that can only come out of faith, right? To put that in that perspective. But man, is that really saying something about what it means to be a Lutheran in a very, very unique context, and perhaps one that's you cannot surpass that experience, or at least the conclusions they made about that experience. It's really incomparable to almost anything else. Yeah.
To add to that, one of the markers of Black ministry in the South, especially for Lutherans, was intense dedication to being a Lutheran. And the Lutheran Pioneer and Missions Tablet over and over tells stories of people who were so dedicated to Lutheranism. I think my favorite one is that there was a church in the South that the Synodical Conference gave up for dead. There just weren't many people who were coming, and so they pulled their resources and went somewhere that was more fruitful. And that church continued to worship for a decade without a pastor, like 4 members, until at the end of that decade, they said, "Send us a pastor, please." And everybody was just like, "What? You guys have stayed Lutherans this whole time? Who does that?" And it really marks how dedicated the people who left their former version of Christianity to come to the Lutheran Church and then participate. It's just amazing.
Yeah, really a lot of thought-provoking thoughts brought up by his example and his words. So I'm curious, what else does he have to offer on the broader topic of, what was his philosophy on race relations and the work of the church? And did he have any larger impact on the church in general in this area?
Yeah, so I think it's good to notice that the timing of the paper that we just looked at, it was in 1938. In 2 sessions of this conference later, they would vote to establish a separate Black synod. The idea was to take all the Black ministry and form a synod so that they could participate in the Synodical Conference as an equal. Because, in the Synodical Conference, churches didn't get a vote, only synods did. And so they wanted to set up a synod so they could get a vote. And so even when Carter is saying we can celebrate these Saxons, he's also working to bring about some integration in the church. And he and the others are really trying to bring about some real political integration and not just a spiritual one. Because it seems like they were really dedicated to the spiritual unity that Lutherans had in practice and in doctrine. And they were working on trying to figure out how to get a political unity as well, so that everybody could have equal rights. One of the steps that he took to bring that about, and there isn't great evidence about this, but in a memo from the early 2000s or late 90s, Richard Dickinson writes about getting a tour from St. Philip Lutheran Church of their building, and how Marmaduke Carter had encouraged his congregation to buy that building because there was office space for a district office. So he had enough office space that they could house a president and get that organization done. And so when in I think it was 1941 won, they voted to explore starting a district or a synod. It was only a few years later that the Synodical Conference voted to integrate the Black churches into their regional churches so that they would be members of synod and have a vote in the synod. I really think that this building and St. Philip were a really big organizational part of saying they're actually serious. We really need to deal with this. And so I just visited their pastor 4 months ago and did an interview with him. And I said, your church may have caused integration because of the building. I mean, there's all sorts of other things, but it's such an interesting history that purchasing a building could have that kind of impact to say, like, we're really serious. One of the other things I think is important is that I think the lecture tours built a bridge to make integration possible as well. It would have seemed foreign for people all over the country to look at these missionary tours or look at these congregations both in Chicago and Detroit and Milwaukee, as well as in the South. And it could have been really easy for them to just not care. But the congregations in Nebraska and Iowa and Wisconsin that Carter visited, they never forgot his visit. I did an interview with Bryant Clancy, who was a 1961 graduate of sometime around there. I might be forgetting the date, actually. A graduate of Emmanuel Lutheran College, and he took over Black ministry when it was an official wing of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. And he visited a lot of these congregations. And every church he went to, they said, "Oh, we remember when Marmaduke Carter came here." And so they'd be talking about it decades later. And so there was a real connection being built by his personally traveling to these places. So I think he is a pivotal character in the story of integration in the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod.
So that leads to the last content question. You mentioned that as being part of his lasting legacy. Is there anything else you want to add to the idea of his legacy, or do you want to comment on how he's been treated by church leaders and historians?
One other important aspect of his leadership is he was really the forefather of Black Lutheran ministry in the North. I don't think he ever had a real official position, but he shows up everywhere. As we're planting Black churches all over the country, places like Detroit and Milwaukee. He's preaching at all of these building dedication ceremonies. He's showing up in St. Louis. And, I showed a map of places he went. If you're looking at cities, it's almost always because somebody called him there to present or preach or come for a Lenten worship service. And so he was very much a mentor for Black Lutheranism across the North. And in Chicago, he was an important figure in that way, just not an official leader, but just a mentor figure for all of the pastors in the area. He also was pivotal in founding the two other specifically Black Lutheran churches in Chicago. One is now Christ the King. It was over where the Ida B. Wells housing project was. And then the other is Resurrection Lutheran Church, way on the south side. And he was instrumental in both of those as a leader and someone who pushed expanding Black ministry in Chicago as people were coming to the area. The unfortunate thing about him is that he was so well known among everyone. Everybody knew who he was. And so when they write about him, and talk about him, there's sort of a sense that you don't really need to actually write about what he did. And so he shows up in all of these histories. There's several different personal memoirs where they just have like this one-liner about Marmaduke Carter, and you can tell he's super important, but you can't tell anything about what he did. Or there's just one little story, or and so there just isn't a lot of information about him. And now that everybody who knew him is dead or almost dead, he's kind of lost. He's simply just not recognized for the amazing contribution he made. And trying to tell that story is incredibly challenging because his work in Chicago, there's nothing written about it. The stories are lost, and you have to piece it together from secondhand sources or from the Lutheran Pioneer or Missions Taube, and there's nothing from witnesses or almost nothing that he himself wrote that remains. And it's a huge challenge to really understand who he is. And one of, I guess, the saddest things about Chicago Lutheran history is that just there's no evidence of him left.
Yeah, well, what a sad way to end your discussion of this. But and I don't know, maybe there's always a chance something else may pop up, and now that as you're doing work on this project and spreading awareness about him, this may just lead to further work and research on him, which is, of course, I think the goal of any historian, right? To just increase awareness about one's topic or figure that you're focusing on. Yeah. So I think
I'm just hoping and praying that someone somewhere has a box of papers stuffed under a stairway or in an unopened attic or something. I'm just hoping and praying that I can find something somewhere that has his actual papers.
Yeah. There's still hope for that, right?
Yeah. every it's unlikely, but maybe.
Yeah. Well, good. Well, hopefully that will happen for you. So that leads us to transition to kind of the more of the history part of this podcast. I'm just curious, first of all, how did you get started on researching Marmaduke Carter and now making it a major part of your historian's focus?
That's a bit of a story. So my first call out of seminary was to St. James Lutheran Church in Chicago. And when I got there, I just fell in love. I fell in love with city life. I fell in love with urban church and city people. And, I adore living in Chicago. And I'm in California now, but it was awesome, wonderful city. But I discovered that Lutherans are terrified of Chicago. It is almost impossible to get Lutheran church workers to come to Chicago or New York or places like that. And I thought to myself, well, this is crazy. Why in the world would people think like this? And so I talked around with pastors and discovered that Chicago was an incredibly important center of Lutheran ministry, and that even back in the 1970s, it was, they had some of the smartest and most influential pastors and thinkers were there. And now it's just like our churches are emptying. Nobody wants to go to the city. It didn't make any sense to me. So I started researching Chicago Lutheran churches. And during the course of that, I discovered and got connected with some of our Black churches on the South and West side. And the more I researched their history and past, the more interested I was in their work. And that put me onto a couple of books about the history of Black ministry. And I kept seeing this guy's name. And I kept going, wow, he's a really interesting man. I wish someone wrote more about it. And and nobody had. So I decided I was going to figure out what this guy was about. And the more I researched about him, the more interested I became. And the more interested in him I became, the more interested in Black ministry generally I became. And that's kind of the story.
That's great. So what was your research method like? Maybe as you discovered there's not much out there. I guess you kind of, the sky was the limit as to what you wanted to do and how you wanted to approach it.
Yeah, the challenge with this is that there's very little written about Black ministry in the Lutheran Church. There is one good scholarly book, and it's Jeff Johnson's Black Christians, The Untold Lutheran Story. And everything else is was written either to be fundraising or to push an agenda within the Lutheran Church. And so it was really hard to find, which, I said, okay, now I need to go find something. And I discovered the Lutheran Pioneer and Missions Tauba, which then led me to other, some of the primary source documents at Concordia Historical Institute, which led me to, there's other ancillary publications. And so most of my research really comes from skimming through everything I can find in all of these corners of the internet and of archives to hopefully find a little mention of him. And so it's really been a really fun detective story where you just find a clue and you chase that clue and then you go, whoa, and that leads you to another thing. So there hasn't been a lot of standard literature to look at. It's mostly just archival sources and historic periodicals.
Yeah, in my personal point of view, I kind of enjoy that side of it anyway. And maybe that's just arrogant. I don't care what other people have to say about it. What did the original sources say? But on one hand, it makes you re-examine things as they were presented, and I think that every historian, it helps them be, more authentic, or it gives you a better chance of being as close to the original as possible when you do that.
And there's always a chance where you rely on a historian who gets it wrong. Mm-hmm. And there's that historian who does it first and he gets it wrong, and then everybody else bases their opinion off of him, and it sort of becomes the accepted idea until you actually go back and look at the sources. Unless you look at the real source, you can't know.
Yeah. So you talked about having the experience of being surprised or excited by your parts of your research, but do you want to share a story or an example of something that really got you excited as you began to uncover more about Marmaduke Carter?
Let's see. I think the surprising amount of good relationships between Black and white Lutherans in all of my research is really the thing that was most exciting. I don't know about you, but the history that I was taught through most of my life of race relations was primarily the history of slavery, Jim Crow, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And there really isn't a story outside of that. The thing that surprised me most was stories of Nathaniel Carter and his work. When I found he wrote a letter thanking everybody about being able to preach in white pulpits and take communion. And I found that in the Lutheran Standard, and I did a little dance, like, woo, this was amazing. And the stories of Capital University. And it's representative of a much broader story that needs to be told. You look at very similar things happening in churches in Chicago as well in the 1960s. So like Chatham Fields Lutheran Church on the South Side integrated without it being a thing. Like nobody cared. And I've asked sometimes the first Black person to come to these old white German churches, and every single person I say, was there any racial conflict? And they looked at me as if it was a stupid question, and they had zero comment after it. And it took me a moment for myself to move on, because I just never had any expectation that that would be the story. And it happens at church after church after church. And so Carter's experience actually wasn't unusual on the congregational level. Pretty amazing.
Yeah, that's a lot of food for thought. You can balance. Okay, now they're the topic of what is our current historiography nationwide doing to this entire topic and conversation, or maybe even broader, what can the history of the church offer into a national conversation on this, or personal level kind of stuff. I mean, this is just kind of a huge thing for so many people, and really everyone needs to consider this, I think, if you're going to interact with other groups of people in the church. So yeah, it has definitely been an eye-opening conversation. I'm glad you're sharing, especially those surprising things, which are surprisingly maybe some good news, and overall not a generally happy topic, although of course you shared some of the negative sides of Marmaduke Carter's experience as well. So I mean, it's a balanced story, but one with a lot of positive lessons, hopefully. So
yeah, and I think I should note that as I'm talking about these surprising things, that doesn't negate there was still a great deal of very aggressive racism in Chicago. But what ended up happening is it was mostly suburban congregations where people fled the city, and there was a suburban urban conflict, and that's where a lot of the real like tough and difficult racism happened. And so it's not like the Lutheran Church was this glorious integrationist dream, but it is good to have some of the balance that we don't have in our history and story.
Yeah, good. So final section today, just maybe, I mean, it's all about you today. It's your topic. You're the guest, but now about your maybe personal side of history in general. Do you have any unanswered questions about this topic on Marmaduke Carter that you're still trying to get answered?
The big unanswered questions are, what happened in Chicago? Like, what was his church like? What were some of his perspectives on life and ministry as it changed in his experience? Everything he did in Chicago is a big question mark. And so you get news stories about how many baptisms, how big the church is, whether they buy a new property, all that. But there really isn't this is how he worshiped. This is his preach style. Those sorts of things is just a giant question mark. And I would really like to answer questions about just what was he like as a pastor? What was the work that he did? I've done some interviews that have gotten into that, but just about everyone is either 96 and doesn't remember a whole lot, or was 10 when they knew him. And so it's a real challenge. And there are so many unanswered questions about Black ministry in general in the Lutheran Church. The amount of writing is just so limited. And one of the things that drives me towards this is I can actually contribute. How many thousand books are there about Martin Luther? But there's almost nothing about this topic broadly. And so there are so many unanswered questions in this, and histories that need to be written. It's a giant question mark.
Yeah. So that makes it a pretty broad broad field. I can anticipate your answers then to my the remaining questions I have. What would you like to see more research and writing done on within Lutheran history? I can anticipate you're saying just this whole massive topic, not just Marmaduke Carter, but the whole spectrum of this. Anything in specific apart from Marmaduke Carter, though, that you think maybe another historian or maybe yourself might get into?
Yeah, I would love to see a well understood history of Emmanuel Lutheran College and Concordia Selma. It's such a controversial topic, especially Concordia Selma, that I think having someone who's a little more detached from it would be really great. It would be good to go through Emmanuel Lutheran College's founding and try to figure out what the motivations were and how it was funded, and just get a really in-depth history of that school as well. It played such a central role in training workers, and it became a symbol by the time it closed rather than being a real institution. And it would be good to get a history of that as well.
Yeah, good point, or good direction for people in the audience to consider if they're looking for something or got insight on that. So finally, do you have any upcoming projects? Are you going to develop this a little bit more, or are you going in other areas?
Well, I am in the middle of, I've taken on a project that is far larger than I should have. This research came out of a project to document the histories of the Lutheran churches in Chicago. And so I've done oral histories of all of the remaining LCMS congregations in the city limits of Chicago, at least the ones that would let me in. And so I have 70 plus oral histories and tens of thousands of pages of archives and 2,000 photographs of the building. And so I'm working on putting that together, likely in an online database. And so I'm working with some institutions that nothing official yet. And I'm also looking for a publisher for a translation that I did of the history of Chicago, which you can find at my blog, huenikwrites.medium.com. And I published it chapter by chapter, but I'm hoping to get it out as a real book to just make it more generally available, since it's just kind of lost in the internet right now.
Yeah. Well, I'll be sure to put a link to that blog on in the episode description for anyone who is listening today or any other time they can look at that. So that's part of the purpose of this podcast, is to help Lutheran historians get their information out there to a broader audience. It's a little more appreciated. I had a fun time looking through the information that you had posted, and a lot of hard work behind it. It would be a shame if you were the only one to enjoy it, but I'm sure many others, once they find it, will appreciate it as well. All right. Any last comments or thoughts you'd like to share with us today before we wrap it up?
No, I don't think so. Well, actually, yeah. I would really like it if we had more regular people doing history. You'll probably notice that I don't have STM or MA or PhD after my name. It is really hard to do serious history without an advanced degree. And I think we need more people doing it. And I think more people should just get interested in a topic and run with it. So if you're out there and you are interested in a topic, research it. Why not? You don't need a degree to do history.
Yeah, absolutely true. I'm kind of between two worlds right now. I'm pursuing a degree, but up to this point, everything I've done has been without one that's dedicated at least to history. But you can definitely do a lot if you have the skill, the aptitude, and maybe most importantly, the interest and willingness to take on a topic. So, all right. Well, thank you, James, for joining us today. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I hope many people we'll continue to follow you and your work.
Thanks for having me here. I love the podcast. I'm glad to be on it.